can you confirm you can hear me okay and see my screen? Okay, great. Thanks everybody for taking the time to come today. I'm Mark Miller, and I thought I'd spend some time talking with you about inclusive practices and software project productivity. Maddie, if people want to ask questions in the chat, you're welcome to for the time being. I think we will have time for Q&A at the end as well. So at that time, if you want to unmute and ask questions, that's great. Feel free to, Maddie, feel free to interrupt me if you're paying attention to chat at any time and want to interrupt me to handle a question there. That's perfectly fine.
Sounds good.
All right. So I'll just give you a little outline. I'll spend a few slides talking a little bit about me and my journey. This talk is actually prepared for not only people at Livermore, but people outside of DOE as well, or considering a career in DOE actually, which actually that potentially includes a lot of you. So there's a few slides on that. Then I'll get into the meat of the discussion, talking about working at the intersection of software and inclusion. Talk about a number of practices for cultivating inclusion in software projects. The second, a little bit on DOE history, I won't go into too much, and then I'll share some resources with you at end. We'll reverse the order of those last two. We'll have a Q&A, and then after the Q&A, we'll do the Kahoot if we have time. So a little about me. I'm 59 years old now. These slides are a little old. 59-year-old cisgender white male. I'm married to someone of a different race. I have advanced degrees in EE and have worked 25 years as a software engineer. I'm passionate about scientific data models, software quality, engineering, and productivity. And I enjoy cycling and hiking and stories that are sort of at the intersection of computing and inclusion. From the creed, we are all created equal. I used to think that the only remarkable difference between me and a woman was anatomical, between me and a Black person was melanin, and between me and an LGBTQ person was sexual gender orientation. In all other respects, I thought we should be equals. And I thought it was enough just to be a good person, to aspire to treat everyone the same, be gender neutral and or colorblind. What I've learned in the past 5 or more years is that that isn't nearly enough, and that approach can even unintentionally perpetuate systemic biases. So several years ago, I decided I needed to take an active role in helping to dismantle systemic bias in the spaces that I routinely operate in. So a little bit about what I've been doing in that. I've taken numerous trainings and tried to contribute to ongoing dialogue within the broader high-performance computing community. I've been routinely studying a lot of media, books, blogs, videos. I've been helping to lead some dialogue within the community aimed at addressing inclusion. I've been participating in book clubs with coworkers involving self-reflective lessons. That's one of the books that we did. That's actually the first book we did was Me and White Supremacy. I've been engaging in sort of self-adopted practices aimed at raising awareness and seeding deeper thought about inclusion, and then volunteering to lead trainings and various other things, such as this activity today. And recently, I just have the privilege of actually working on the LLNL Computing Department's DEI committee. So I just want to give you all a little bit of background on the Department of Energy. Just I'm assuming many of you are already aware of this, probably maybe even why you are here at Livermore Labs for the summer. But the Department of Energy is effectively the Department of Science. The National Lab Complex in the United States does a tremendous amount of scientific research. You can see by budgets just how much science is involved within the Department of Energy. And we do basically science in the national interest. The laboratories are an outgrowth of research that was funded during World War II. And we typically work on big science, multidisciplinary teams, and complex R&D challenges. So this is just a bulleted list of a number of things. Many of them you may have heard of that have come out of Livermore Labs. And I'll just focus on one you probably all heard about within the last 6 to 8 months, and that is the ability to demonstrate laser fusion. That was here at the National Ignition Facility A bunch of lasers were aimed to converge at a point, and if you took all the power that went into the lasers that converged at that point, they actually got more power out of that reaction than the lasers that went into it. And that's the first time in history, after working on this problem for 60 years, that that was achieved. Kind of a big milestone in laser fusion. So there's a number of labs within the Department of Energy complex. Livermore Labs is one of them. Not too far away, there's another one, the Lawrence Berkeley Lab. Just if you're on site at Livermore, it's 60, 70 miles away, a little bit closer to the west in the Bay Area, and then labs throughout the country as well. So I spent 25 years, or actually 30 years now, working at Livermore Labs, and I have to say, every week I come in, I'm excited about the work I do, and I'm excited about who I get to do it with. And that's after doing it for 30 years. I think that's a blessing, and I've really enjoyed my time and the kind of problems I get to solve working at DOE. So that's just a little plug for DOE Labs. So, okay, moving on to what we came here for. I want to talk a little bit about working at the intersection of software and inclusion, and I'll just start with some introductory remarks about that. What I found is often talking about topics related to inclusion, it reminds me of the experience of holding two truths. And the proverbial example I like to give for that, we've probably all seen it, is this cup half full or half empty. Some people see it one way, some people see it the other. And of course, because we're at a science lab, there's always going to be someone in the audience that's going to say, well, Mark, actually that glass is completely full. Some of it's a fluid and some of it's a gas. And that's scientifically correct as well. But I'm just bringing it up to say that we often have different perspectives and on things, and we should all be actually pretty comfortable with this. So some other really well-known science examples are, for example, the wave-particle duality of light. Sometimes light behaves like a wave, sometimes it behaves like a particle, and we have wholly different sets of systems of equations in dealing with those two perspectives on light. General relativity versus quantum mechanics, another sort of dual vision for the way that we sort of understand the world. And for us here in computer science, bubble sort is the worst or bubble sort is the best. And it kind of depends on whether you're worried about time complexity or space complexity. And then finally, one of my own is, I think I'm a good person, but I can often perpetuate systemic bias if I'm not careful. So I say all that to say, for some, what we discuss here may feel like it isn't nearly enough to meet the moment, and I really can't argue with that. For others, it may feel like it's way too much, and both perspectives are true. So what is inclusion? It's about ensuring that people with diverse identities and experiences have equitable access to resources and opportunities and feel welcomed, valued, and encouraged to contribute as their full, authentic selves in any particular group or activity. If inclusion is being asked to the part, I'm sorry, if diversity is being asked to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance. We can also sort of ask, what is anti-inclusion? This is sort of my take on it. It's a differential treatment or evaluation, basically bias, based solely on non-causal attributes, such as, fill in the blank, whatever people tend to use. So you don't have to subscribe to any supremacy ideologies to manifest or perpetuate isms, racism, sexism, ableism, ageism, and so forth. There are actually a lot of dimensions to inclusion. The ones we're probably most familiar with, we hear maybe talked about in the news and so forth, are things like race and ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, and so forth. So those are fairly familiar dimensions. They tend to get quite a bit of attention when the topic of diversity and inclusion is discussed. But the truth is, inclusion is actually even broader than that. There's many other dimensions. There's neurodiversity, handedness. About 10% of the world is left-handed, and that actually has certain consequences for left-handed people. It turns out I'm dyslexic. I was more so when I was younger, and definitely when I get tired, I'm very dyslexic, especially with numbers. But there's various levels of visual impairment within our population, hearing impairment, speaking impairment, other things. English as a second language, for example, immigration status. So there's just once you start to put on the thinking cap about what inclusion and diversity really are, you can think about all of these different dimensions. One is culturally relevant legal holidays. Next Monday, I have the privilege of actually taking Juneteenth off next Monday. I didn't have that privilege 2 years ago. And I find that a culturally relevant holiday. And That's not always true for everyone. Excuse me, I got to get a drink of water. Bad idea to eat nuts before you talk. So let's see. Another one I'll focus on here is disability. And the reason I do want to focus on this a little bit is often when we think about disability, our minds tend to go to those who are dealing with permanent disabilities. But the truth of the matter is, unless you're extremely lucky, you will experience disability yourself in your own life, either temporary, like you're injured in an accident of some kind, maybe you're recovering from surgery or whatever, and as a result, your hearing is degraded. And then, of course, situational disability essentially happens all the time in noisy environments at an airport when you're trying to participate in a meeting and you can't hear real well. So all of us should have some sensitivity to or appreciation for that dimension of inclusion as well, just because we tend to experience it at least a little bit. And I'll just say my passions, where I tend to focus a lot of my time and attention, are the race, ethnicity, and gender dimensions. So just real quick, some findings on inclusion and productivity. So organizations with inclusive cultures are 2 times as likely to meet or exceed financial targets, 3 times as likely to be high performing, 6 times more likely to be innovative and agile, and 8 times more likely to achieve better business outcomes. Those are a lot of really positive impacts of having an inclusive culture. So where does inclusion play a role in software development? And my sense is it plays a role in almost all aspects of development. Our communications, whether it's emails, chats, tweets, whatever, the documentation we write, the presentations we put together, the interfaces we design, whether we're talking about GUIs or command line interfaces, the actual code we write. I have an example of that later on. We'll get into, our collaboration, just almost all aspects of software development, inclusion plays a role. So one of the things that's interesting about us as software developers is the power to name. I think literally every day I'm asked to name some new function that I'm writing or some new file that I've created. And that power to name, I mean, variable names, type names, class names, whatever, we do this every day. It's kind of somewhat unique to the life as a software developer. That power to name is, there's a lot that goes with that. So whether it's projects or products or files, functions, variables, it's important to, especially when we're creating something that's going to be lasting as part of a project, to consider that. And we'll get into more of that when we talk about some inclusive language. The names we use in our code and associated artifacts can invite people in or push them away. And again, I'll have an example. Well, actually, this is the example. So take, for example, this particularly prolific and egregious example is the use of master-slave in code. So maybe this may be news to some of you, but within the tech community, the language of master-slave is used to describe a lot of different algorithms and aspects in things used in computing. And I'll just share a few: slide surfaces, multi-point constraints, periodic boundary conditions, parallel runtime paradigms, for example. It's used, it's very prolific throughout high performance computing. In fact, if you go onto GitHub and search, you'll find literally tens of millions of hits of this kind of thing in code. But there has been public discourse to replace this language in software that goes back almost certainly to the mid-90s. People have been making appeals like, hey, can we stop using this language in our software? And so a couple of codes, a couple of flagship simulation codes, AL3D here at Livermore and Sierra at Sandia, they completed last year replacing the use of this terminology throughout their projects. We can talk a little bit more about that later. There was quite a bit involved in that, but it was great to see these 2 flagship projects take that on. I will say that if you put aside the people developing the software and just look at the software that we write, the software itself is actually very inclusive if you look at the way it's designed. So the truth is we support GUIs and our documentation in multiple human languages. And for example, I work on the Visit Visualization project, and we support a French interface to Visit. I think there's a Spanish one. I think there's a German one, and of course English as well. Most of the developers on the project are English. So that's in a way that's our software and our project trying to be more inclusive just by the way it's designed. We value application programming interface and application binary interface compatibility in libraries like MPI, GL, and BLAS. That interoperability is a manifestation of inclusion in software. We design our applications to support various levels of precision, single, double, mixed precision, and so forth. I could go on. We want our libraries to support multiple different solvers, for example. All of this is a manifestation of inclusion in our software. Different file formats and analysis tools, interface bindings, and so forth. So again, setting the people aside and just looking at the code that we write, that code manifests a lot of principles of inclusion. Okay, so we're out of that now, a little bit of the motivation, and we'll move on to some simple practices that you can consider to implement or advocate for in most of the contexts that you will encounter. One is inclusive language practices. We already touched on this briefly. If you can go to inclusivenaming.org, that's one organization that's trying to develop a set of standards for inclusive language in software. And it's actually being led by a number of tech companies such as Linux Foundation, Kubernetes. I think Microsoft and IBM are involved in it as well. Another thing you can do is if you work on projects that already are in existence and they have the branch name maybe master, you could consider replacing that to something like main or stable or developer or whatever. If you're starting new projects, you can just right at the get-go decide to adopt a branch name that doesn't use master, for example. That's another example of inclusive language. You can make an appeal for your projects, the ones that you're working on, to adopt a code of conduct. Basically, a code of conduct is how a project's business is conducted and how the people doing it are sort of expected to behave. So the code of conduct kind of identifies behavior that is wholly unacceptable, things like harassment, violence, that kind of thing. And then there are statements about things that the project values, like we value inclusive dialogue, safe spaces, and so forth. A code of conduct will also sort of deal with out of bounds behavior. It says how it's dealt with, who to contact for help when code of conduct violations are observed. And then it may also indicate a range of corrective actions that can be taken on a project. So this table over here on the right is a sampling from a article I read written in 2017 about various codes of conduct. The names of them go down the left there. Contributor covenant is a very popular one, for example, and then how many GitHub projects they found that were using those. Geek feminism is another one that's quite popular. Citizen as well. Those are all different codes of conduct. You're welcome to go look for them and read them for yourself online. They all say very roughly similar things. Another thing you can do on a software project is try to gender neutralize your project's documentation. I see this in a lot of documentation when you're writing something about giving maybe describing a user in a particular document. You may refer to the user as his or he or whatever. It's a little bit more inclusive to actually try to avoid even using pronouns at all, but just basically not have to refer to the gender of the individual. And it's very easy to do that. There's 3 examples in this case of a statement and various revisions of that statement to get it to more gender neutrality. And this could potentially be quite an undertaking if you've got a lot of documentation. You can advocate for something called an inclusive minute or inclusive moment in your project meeting agendas. This is designed to be a relatively short exercise so it can be incorporated into project meetings, where someone introduces a factoid, resource, or event or experience, and they just talk about it with respect to what inclusion topics and issues it helps to shed light on. Let's see. So in software projects, when I do this, and I do this in a number of different projects now, it's nice to be able to come up with topics that are sort of at the nexus of inclusion and software development. Really, the goals of this activity are simply to raise awareness and to see deeper thinking. let's see, and it's like I say, it's practiced in many teams and organizations. In fact, many of you may have already encountered this in your work. So an example of what an inclusive minute might look like is a quick review of the film Coded Bias or Imitation Games, highlighting a pioneering individual such as Lynn Conway, or pointing out online inclusive design resources such as this one from Microsoft, for example. And the team just spends a few minutes talking about it before they move on to the rest of their project agenda. It's not always the case, but quite often you do have some flexibility in the imagery that you are using in your presentations or in your blog posts or elsewhere in your documentation. And when you do have that flexibility, finding ways to pick images that are more inclusive, I think is also very powerful. So a couple of the articles that you see depicted here on the left are blog posts that I wrote for the Better Scientific Software site. I'm seeing chat as it comes by, and I'm kind of getting distracted, but I saw someone mention Hidden Figures. Love that movie. That was a great movie. Yeah, that'd be a great topic to bring up as an inclusive minute, for example. So yeah, these two articles, I had some choice in what the imagery that was going to be used in them. And for example, the one on the front, there's a woman there working at Raytheon. She's working on the Apollo guidance computer. There were a whole bunch of women that worked on assembling the Apollo guidance computer, and I was fascinated to find out that there were some Black women that worked on it, and I wanted to get a picture of that. And it turns out Raytheon had one. And likewise, the other one, it's not often that you see Black men portrayed in, for example, high performance computing literature. This case, I think I was on the Better Scientific Software site. I was writing something about keeping your vision fit, and I had complete freedom over what image that I wanted to put there, and so I chose to pick that image. So give some thought to the imagery that you use, and often it can make things more inclusive. This is a very practical situation. So a fairly large percentage of the population has various levels of impaired vision, especially when it comes to color vision, something called color vision deficient, or you may have also heard it called color blindness. So making sure that your GUIs do not introduce problems for color vision deficient people is an example. Another one is, for example, if you're dealing with mobile devices, making sure that your controls support both lefties and righties. It's an example of an interface that really only worked for right-handed people, not left-handed people in that picture. It turns out if you select appropriate fonts in your documentation, you can reduce problems for dyslexic people as well. So there's a lot of things you can think about in terms of making presentations and documentations more accessible to a wider audience. Showing your pronouns in your profiles. I believe I'm showing mine here in WebEx. I can't actually see, but not every product gives you a separate place to include your pronouns. So sometimes you can embed it in your name itself. That's what I've done here, I think, in WebEx. At least I hope I have. I wasn't paying attention to this when I logged on. But there's so many different places that we have profile information, and so you can include your pronouns in your profiles. This is my example on GitHub where there wasn't, well, at least the time I did it, there wasn't a specific place, so I just included it as part of my name. Holiday observances. So if you think about what we do around the holidays, people will dress up, they'll share slogans and greetings. We do some decorating maybe, or cook special foods, and we take time to celebrate. And just basically acknowledging and recognizing other holidays in those ways can be a powerful way of demonstrating inclusion. You've probably heard of land acknowledgements, and so land acknowledgements is another way to do that as well. I was going to get into land grant universities and how they relate to STEM education in this country. I have a few slides on that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to skip through these, and if we have time, we'll come back. I will say it is a very interesting topic. If you look at STEM education in this country, I'll give you one factoid right now. Over 30% of the STEM degrees that are awarded in the United States and universities in the United States come from colleges that were created by land grants. And those land grants go back to legislation that was created in 1865. And then 1892 as well, and then some legislation that came on much later. And we can talk about that more, but I'm going to go through these and come back to them if we have time. So apologies for this really quickly. Another thing you can do is host a book club. I've been involved in a book club with various colleagues now for a couple of years. To be honest, we're on hiatus recently, haven't met in a couple of months. But these are various of the books that we've dealt with in book clubs. Let's see. Another thing, again, it wouldn't immediately be obvious to you, but time zone can represent an inclusion issue. If you're a big project, I don't know if you've heard about the SPAC project here at Livermore, but there are hundreds of developers all throughout the world that work on SPAC. And when they have meetings, how do they get together? How do they handle this? So being cognizant of your collaborators' time zones, maybe alternating meeting times from one week to the next, have a morning meeting one week and an afternoon meeting the next week. There are ways of trying to be more accommodating about all of your collaborators' time zones. I had a colleague from Argonne who he went to visit his family in India for a month, and so we were having our meetings, and it was like 11 o'clock at night for him when he was trying to participate in those when he was away. I probably should have changed the meeting time for that. I have myself, I like to add a little quote at the end of all my emails. So I found a way to kind of be inclusive when I do that. These are just some examples. For example, probably you've all heard the Albert Einstein quote, "It's harder to crack prejudice than an atom." Let's see, if one is accustomed to privilege, equality can feel like oppression. Yeah, so I have a whole bunch of email signatures, and I change it about once a month, and then all my emails for that month will have one of those go out as well. Finally, I'll just say, be curious about history relevant to your community. So I'll just share real quickly the word computer. I don't know how many of you may be familiar with this, but the word computer in human history is only referred to a machine within about the last 60, 70, 80 years. Prior to that, it would typically refer to a human being, and most often a woman, because a long time ago, computing and calculating was considered, tedious work, and women, there were a lot of women that contributed to science through helping doing the very complex math that was done. In fact, this is actually spoken to a little bit in the movie Hidden Figures. Where does the word bug come from? I don't know if you all know the history of Ada Lovelace and where that word comes from, but why do we call problems? Yeah, moths. Yeah, there you go. Yeah. Where's the term software engineering come from? So understanding where this terminology that we use in our world comes from, I think is very useful. Why was was Haley the first to discover the comet that bears his name? We can talk about that. What was the first culture to know pi to 5 significant digits? I find these questions very fascinating, and so I like to dig into them. So let's see. I'm going to skip over this. We can come back to it a bit, but it's a little bit on the history of the Manhattan Project and DOE that I think is very relevant to working here at Livermore Labs. But I'm just going to skip through this for now. What does inclusion look like and feel like when it's being practiced? So I think this is really important. You want to ask yourself, as I look around, what should I see, or what do I expect to see if I'm working in an environment that basically practices what it values in terms of inclusion? So in my view, one of the ways, an easy way to ask that question is, let's pick a metaphor. Let's find something that organizations already take very seriously and ask how those organizations handle that area, that topic, and then kind of map it back to inclusion. And the thing that I consider this for is safety. If you look at safety culture and what's involved. So I found an online article about 25 different ways you can identify an organization that's serious about safety. And the idea is you pick each of these, each of the statements about safety, and just replace the concept of safety with inclusion, and then ask, am I seeing that around here? Do I see that around here? So number 2, all employees throughout the organization exhibit working knowledge of inclusion, for example. Number 4, there is a lack of competing priorities. Inclusion comes in first every time, for example. So this is a way to ask yourself what inclusion looks like when it's actually being practiced. Number 22 there's a concrete definition of success looks like for inclusion in your program. So I would say go to that resource, go to that site. In fact, I keep on forgetting to do this. Everybody should have these slides ahead of time, and I will get Maddie the copy of these slides to send out. In fact, I can't select this link and put it in the chat too easily right now. But you can do the exercise yourself, and that's what I'm proposing. I will say, if I look at my own life and what has manifested in my own practices as a result of emphasizing inclusion, and I'll list several of those here. Thank you, whoever pasted that. Thank you. One is getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. I think that's just the nature of the business of especially trying to really work together, especially across broad swaths of the population where there may be differences in the way we communicate, differences in style, and so forth. Having regular conversations about privilege, race, gender, sexual identity, and orientation. This is not something I used to do, and now I do probably on a weekly basis. Taking trainings and participating in dialogue with coworkers, again, that's happening on roughly, for me, a weekly basis, maybe at worst monthly. Reading and keeping up to date with current body of knowledge, that's pretty much every day now for me. I routinely have cause to question my own assumptions. So in responding to an enhancement request, maybe I'll type the phrase "no can do," and then I'll ask myself, where did that phrase come from? Where does "no can do" come from? Turns out there's an interesting history of where that phrase comes from. And again, why do they call it Haley's Comet, for example? Or is there a more gender neutral way of saying or writing this? So often I'm in the middle of an email and I'm getting through and I'm using some phrase I've always used, and I'll say, why am I using that? Where does that come from? And I'll do a little research. And then another one is, do you intentionally interact with I'm putting in air quotes here, others, but people that you haven't necessarily a lot of experience or even comfort levels interacting with in the past? Do you get over that sort of affinity bias and try to interact with people outside of your comfort zone? I think if you do, number one, you'll find out how similar we all are and similar interests and so forth. But it's also a great learning opportunity. So those are ways that the artifacts of the practice of inclusion actually manifest in my life. Let's see. So some resources. If you're not familiar with resources here at Livermore Labs, I believe, boy, I hope that's the correct link. Joining an ERG. Thank you, whoever said that, an ERG. That was going to be my next one. I think we have 10 ERGs here at Livermore. I'm listing several of them here. And that's employee research groups. Great to get involved with one of the ERGs here. Then there's various programs that Livermore itself is involved in, STEM outreach programs, and recruiting programs, especially for younger people. There's even a program here where I think, I forget how much time, but maybe 4 hours. It's 4 hours a month. I forget what the amount is, but you're encouraged to go out and actually speak to local schools, and you're given a certain amount of time to go out and actually give presentations STEM presentations to local schools, and the lab will actually support that. I've done that on one occasion so far. Actually, I guess it was 32 hours for the entire year. There you go. That's the fourth bullet there. This is, again, I should have got this out ahead of time. Ton of links in here on some of the resources that I've used, whether it's movies, books, websites, and articles of research. I will get this to Maddie, and Maddie can get it out to you. And I apologize for not getting it out first. All right, so I'm going to bring it to a close there with sort of a survey or overview of inclusive practices and software projects, and we can open it up for some Q&A, and then after that, if we have some time, we can do the Kahoot. It's not necessary to do the Kahoot, just kind of a brain teaser, kind of fun. So I'm going to stop sharing there so we can kind of just talk.
Hi, Mark. Not so much questions, but I got a few comments. One is from Nathan. Merge sort is the best. And from Scout, they really like the power wheel in the presentation. And then they hadn't considered the naming power before, which I thought was pretty interesting too, since I'm not very familiar with these types of stuff. So that was something I learned today as well. Did anybody have any questions for Mark, or was there something new that you also learned today? Any information that you've learned about that could maybe be, new to Mark? Oh, thank you, Scout. Thank you, Natalie.
Yeah, thanks for putting those links in. Yeah, don't be bashful. I mean, there's a new message that I think there's a new what is the why is it prefer use gender neutral versus gender? And I'll be honest, I'm not sure I actually captured that resource quite correctly. Gender agnostic versus gender neutral. To me, agnostic and neutral sound almost the same. And so I don't have a good answer for that, other than maybe one is essentially trying to avoid even having to talk about gender at all, versus another that, well, it's going to do it, but it's going to do it in a gender neutral way. That may be the best thing. Presentation. Oh, thanks for the remarks there, Scout. Yeah, some people don't use any pronouns, as it turns out.
I did have a question. I saw earlier on the slides, there were pronouns that I didn't know about, like the XE or XIM. Those pronouns, I've never seen those before personally.
Oh,
And I was
right.
just wondering what they are.
Yeah, so Z and others. So there are other pronouns that sort of get out of the standard he and she and they pronouns that are sort of used in English. I think I see those used more often in Europe. I think Z, for example. But I don't honestly know. And to be honest, I haven't researched that in detail. I just am aware that they exist as alternatives.
That's more than I knew before. That's awesome. Thank you. And for anybody on this call, of course, just feel free to unmute and ask questions. Otherwise, I can keep reading them off of the chat.
Oh, are there more questions in the chat? I was looking back to see if there were.
I don't see any new ones right now.
Okay.
Oh, we got one from Natalie.
Okay.
I'd love to hear about the land grant stuff.
Okay. Yeah, I'm happy to do that. Do you think it'll take me another 5 minutes, Maddie? You think that's okay?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So let me, I'm sorry, let me go. I'm going to get back to that set of slides. Okay. Did I go back too far? Oh, there we are. Okay. Give me just 1 minute before okay, now let me share PowerPoint. Okay, so are you seeing that slide on land acknowledgements?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I'll just go through a number of factoids about this. So land grant universities and STEM education in the United States. I just found this fascinating. But back in the right around the time of the Civil War, as a matter of fact, there was a great interest in teaching and providing ways to teach more and more agriculture and mechanic arts to the general population at large, basically the working classes, to obtain a practical education. And so there was an act, the Morrill Act of 1862, of grants of land. And the way to think about this is the land that we're talking about granting is ultimately land that was basically taken from the indigenous populations that were here. And that land was all over the country. In fact, there was a lot of land in the Central Valley of California that was given to other states. Every state was given 30,000 acres of land, but that land was all over the place in the country. And those states could do anything they wanted to raise funds to start universities. That was the whole point of it. So 54 institutions were created with this land, Cornell. There are institutions in operation today that still are using this land and actually profiting from the land from this 1862 piece of legislation. So there was another Morrill Act of 1890. So 1862 created a bunch of universities throughout the country. But it turns out no Black people were going to any of those universities. Even in the 1890s, that was not happening. So they let the Congress realize, well, we need to do something about that. So they created another Morrill Act of 1890 that created 19 institutions, which we know today as the historically black colleges and universities, HBCUs. And then finally in 1994, there's a realization that, well, we're really not reaching indigenous populations, which are the populations who ultimately had all the land that created all this to begin with. So in 1994, there was another land grant that started 34 indigenous institutions. And so this is a map of all of them, the red dots in 1862, and then the HBCUs 1890, and then the indigenous universities 1994, all over the country. University of California, I went to UC Davis. University of California was started by a land grant. So what are the lasting impacts of that? 18 of the top 25 CS degree producers in the country are land grant colleges. 30% of engineering degrees come from land grant colleges. If you look at all the international students that this country educates, 34% of our PhD STEM degrees come from land grant colleges. The first Black student in a school in the South was in 1953. And then for indigenous populations, 0.5%, 0.5% of STEM students, and less than 0.5% in the workforce, but there's actually 2% of the population in indigenous people in the population. So they're well below representation where they ought to be. And I guess that, you know, there's some other remarks. If you follow, when you get these slides, if you follow the link to the article about Cornell, there is an amazingly fascinating history of how there was someone at Cornell that was incredibly ingenious at turning the land into money. And they were able to secure all sorts of really amazing things that helped to start Cornell University. Ezra, I want to say Ezra Cornell is the name of the person. I can't remember entirely. But that article is a fascinating history of how this worked. And just so you know, each state got land from all over the country, and they decided what they wanted to do with that land. And even today, there are many colleges that still have that land. They're making money off of rent that they use on the land. They're making money by selling parcels of it. It's still actually creating money today. So I'll end there. And thanks for that detour. It's just a fascinating history.
Mark, we got another question actually from Nathan. What ethnicity is your wife and how did you meet?
Oh, she's, yeah. So we met as students at UC Davis, and she's Black.
All right. I think those are all the questions I see in the chat. Do you want to start on the Kahoot game?
We can, yeah. Let's see if we can make that work. I think I've got the web page up for it.
All right.
Let's see. Okay, so I'm first got to start the game here, and then I will share. Which one is it? Screen, Safari. I think I want to share Safari. Are you seeing the inclusivity challenge? Oh, wait a minute. I haven't started. It hasn't started. Classic mode. Sorry.
There we go.
Yeah, I see it.
Okay. I'm assuming players know how to do this. But you here, I'll cut 4170954. Bring up your cell phone. Go to www.kahoot.it and then enter that number. And oh, somebody made it in. And you can do this, I think, on your cell phone. You can also do it on your web browser. The questions are sort of all about what we chatted about here today. It's just kind of a brain teaser, maybe make you think about things. Some of the questions you do end up having to read all the possible responses before you select them, but it's also player limit reach. What's going on here? Hang on. Sorry about that.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I got a couple of students saying there's a player limit.
Yeah, hang on a second. I'm using in theory, I'm using comps. Hang on a second. Let me just stop sharing. Let me see if I can fix that. Am I logged in? Oh, me. Home. All right. My apologies to those who joined. I'm actually going to exit. I'm not sure why that. I'm going to leave page and I'm going to see The only way I can run this with a group of more than 10 is out of Comp's main account, and I thought I was doing that all right, but maybe not. Okay, let me go to the library of Cahoots. There it is. Start. Let's see if I can do it. I'm going to restart it and see if this fixes it. I won't know. Let's see. It's asking me if I want to upgrade. I think we'll try it again, but I think we may be stuck, and I'll reshare again here. Apologies.
Alrighty. Do you think we'll still be okay in the next 13 minutes?
It only takes about 5 minutes to go through it.
True.
Maybe 10. So let's see.
Alright.
Okay, so it's not gonna work. My apologies to everybody. It looks like maybe we need to upgrade. Well, one of two things is happening. I'm using an account that Comp no longer actually is using and didn't check in, and so my apologies for that. That would have been fun to play. It always is fun to play, but I mean, we can play it with just the 3 if you want.
Also, I know Mark is also hosting an Apple Time later on, so there will be an opportunity to replay this. So just keep posted on the calendars, and just that should be coming up, I think, not this Friday, but the next one after this, I believe.
Okay.
So we'll still have an opportunity to play this on. But otherwise, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today on our summer seminar series. These will, again, keep happening every Wednesday at 1 p.m. And then every Friday we have Apple Time, which starts at 12 p.m. And it's just something very casual and fun. And you should be seeing that in the events. But otherwise, thank you so much for joining today, and we really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark.
All righty. Bye-bye, everyone.
All right, feel free to hop up. Have a good one.
All righty.
Bye, thank you.